is Walter Ferguson, columnist for the Tulsa Tribune. My, what a waste of husbands, scarce as they are. Mrs. Nannie Doss has confessed that she has poisoned 4. Truly, this is no time for women to be killing men. Keeping a husband is a major project of American wives who must meet strong outside competition from altar to grave. Yet in spite of all of these facts, this Mrs. Doss was able to bury 4 husbands and seemed to have very little trouble getting new ones after each funeral. Which brings us face to face with a strange streak in the male nature. What peculiar weakness sent all of these men into her parlor? They all lived in communities where droves of gentle-hearted spinsters and widows pined for the chance to feed and comfort and love a husband. What then prompts men to bypass this type and go for the kind who doses them with rat poison? It's beyond me, but the story proves again that a great many men have no knack for picking wives. We can't imagine a woman in her right mind killing off men the way Mrs. Doss claims to have done.
Welcome back to the Coroner's Report. My name is Steve Nawojczyk, and I'm a retired coroner of 2 of the largest counties in the state of Arkansas, and I also served as the director of the State Crime Lab. Today I'm retired, and when I'm not out in the woods with my dog Butter, I like to review old cases with my partner, Tracey Carrington. We introduced you in the last part to prolific serial killer Nannie Doss. In just 9 years, she poisoned 4 husbands and possibly many other family members. But by 1954, her killing spree was over. Nannie Doss had been caught. Her 5th and final husband died in a hospital in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and a smart internist in the ER knew something just wasn't right. When they did the autopsy, they found that poor old Sam Doss had enough rat poison in him to kill a whole city of rats. So the Oklahoma police started looking at the deaths of her other husbands and family members.
What they found stopped them in their tracks and set off newspapers all across the country. Everyone was following this story thanks to the wire services.
An examination of the body of Richard Morton, who died in May of last year in Emporia, Kansas, contained arsenic. Morton's stomach, liver, and kidneys showed a positive reaction to arsenic when tested. He said there were 2.7 milligrams per pound in his stomach, 4 milligrams per pound in his liver, which was even more than found in the body of Doss.
Investigators across 4 states began retracing the macabre trail of death associated with Nannie Doss. More bodies were being disinterred.
We're still awaiting word from both Lexington, North Carolina and Anniston, Alabama about the results of an examination of 3 bodies exhumed in the last few days.
The investigators were covering all their bases, and then Captain Steege in Tulsa, he hit a bonanza.
The trunk and suitcase had been stored in a Tulsa man's home shortly after Doss's funeral, and they were found today when the man called me about the baggage. We took the items to County Attorney Edmondson's office, and we were joined there by Ray Page with the Oklahoma State Crime Bureau, who had just gotten back from his 30-day trip to North Carolina and Alabama on an arsenic odyssey.
It still amazes me how all these different state, local, and county law enforcement agencies worked together back then. What they found was a bizarre contradiction. Nannie, it seemed, was guilty of murder several times over, but to most family and friends, she was beloved. Still, some professed to have seen a sinister streak in her long ago.
Beloved until you crossed her. In that trunk, they discovered even more potential victims in waiting. There were also 27 photos by a photographer hired by Nannie showing her at the funerals of her suspected victims. In several photos, Nannie was smiling into the camera as other family members looked somber. In the trunk, they also discovered 5 Bibles, 3 of which belonged to her 5th husband, Samuel Doss.
They were almost like trophies.
Exactly. Of course, back then, it's not like they really knew much about serial killers, but Captain Steege,
left nothing to chance.
I plan to contact Miss Virginia Ellis in Bluefield, West Virginia. We found a letter addressed to Nannie from Miss Ellis dated December the 2nd, which was 3 days after we arrested Nannie. Miss Ellis was writing to Nannie stating her mother had died and her sister was ill. Miss Ellis wanted Nannie to come nurse the sister and was asking how much Nannie would charge. We never knew that Nannie had been in Bluefield.
Investigators were soon questioning a man from Golden, Colorado, Mr. F.M. Pomeroy. His photo had been found in the trunk. Nannie told investigators Mr. Pomeroy had been corresponding with her but hadn't proposed marriage yet. Frank Pomeroy said he was not a member of a Lonely Hearts Club and he did not know Nannie.
Well, it's not like anyone would want to admit they almost married a serial killer. From Colorado to Oklahoma to Kansas to Alabama to North Carolina, investigators tracked Nannie's trail. Ray Page, an agent with the Oklahoma State Crime Bureau, found evidence of more poisonings.
I have been informed by Mrs. Doss's relatives that they may have been dosed with poison while Mrs. Doss was visiting North Carolina earlier this year. Both Miss Doss's brother and her son-in-law reportedly became violently ill during her visit. Another person, a female in-law, died suddenly during Mrs. Doss's stay, and we're checking that out.
Nannie complained about all her husbands. Charlie was a womanizer and a drunk, but she didn't kill him. Frank was an alcoholic. Arlie was a womanizer and an alcoholic. Morton was also a womanizer and alcoholic. And then poor Sam, he was too Christian. You just couldn't please old Nannie. And when you couldn't please Nannie, she'd off you.
Charlie and Nannie's great-granddaughter, Nicole Young, remembers the stories she heard growing up.
I've heard my mother tell me to have to go get her because she'd run off. She wanted storybook love. They were all ended up being drinkers or out chasing skirts. They weren't what she read about in the books.
Nannie's own daughter, Melvina, assisted investigators.
Mother is a strong-tempered person. When someone did something against her, she just had to get revenge. I feel sure that other relatives have died of poison and we want it cleared up.
Everywhere that Nannie went, it seems someone got sick.
She may have misjudged the dosage and failed to kill another intended victim, a brother, William Roscoe Hazel of Lexington, North Carolina. He became ill with arsenic poisoning symptoms last spring and entered a veterans hospital.
As the bodies came up in North Carolina, Arlie Lanning's family had asked for an autopsy when he died, but there wasn't enough evidence at the time to warrant it.
In North Carolina, they also dug up Arlie's mother, Sarah Lanning. She had died in 1951, and Nannie had nursed her during the last days of her life. Her body tested negative.
Well, I guess she just didn't piss off Nannie.
I think that's the key to all of this. Can someone's motive simply be they pissed me off?
Nannie's daughter, Melvina, spoke to investigators and told them she had questions about the deaths of her two children. Other family members of Nannie's also urged on the investigators.
In Alabama, Judd Harrelson, brother to Frank Harrelson, husband number 2, told police his suspicions about Nannie.
I asked the Western authorities out in Oklahoma to look into my brother's death here in Jacksonville, Alabama. My brother Frank died in September of 1945. And the circumstances were a lot like those in the story in the paper I read. Me and my sister, we're ready to cooperate with authorities and will approve the exhumation of our brother's body if investigators ask.
If charges should materialize out of any of these exhumations, the widow Doss might not take top billing, but she wouldn't have to give much ground to the notorious poisoners of history.
Investigators even looked at the death of Nannie's daughters back in 1924. It was 32 years later when they tried to find those little unmarked graves with no success. The old cemetery had become a military reservation and they couldn't find the babies' graves. The question remains, did Nannie start her killing career with her first 2 babies or much later? Dr. Randy Hill says the graves themselves could still hold a clue.
The irony is you could dig those corpses up to this day and do arsenic level on it and determine whether they had arsenic poisoning.
They have exhumed the bodies of Nannie's sister, grandson, second husband, third, fourth, and fifth husband, and her mother-in-law.
The body count began stacking up. Ray Page, an agent with the Oklahoma Crime Bureau, made a shocking announcement.
Nannie Doss's mother died of arsenic poisoning. We received the Lexington, North Carolina autopsy report this afternoon from Duke University. Miss Doss's daughter became suspicious when her mother confessed to poisoning 4 husbands. The vital organs taken from the mother's body tested for a strong positive of arsenic. The mother, Miss Louisa Holden Hazel, died at Lexington, North Carolina, January 3, 1953, just 2 days after a visit from Mrs. Doss.
Nannie wasn't pleased.
I did not kill my mother. I didn't do it. I wouldn't think of feeding a lethal dose to my blood kin. I love my mother more than I love my own life. I didn't feed that stuff to any of my kin.
Newspaper accounts said the once giggling grandmother was now sulking and showing anger for the first time when she was confronted with the toxicologist report on her own mother. Remember, her mother had been ill, and that might have played a role into why Nannie may have poisoned her, according to Dr. George McCoy.
Mrs. Doss may rationalize these destructive acts by saying the person had an incurable disease which was causing great suffering and misery.
So because her mother was suffering and near death reportedly from cancer, it was okay to just dose her up on rat poison and push her over a bit? Come on.
Seems so. McCoy's evaluation certainly seemed accurate from what we know today. Investigator Page was also suspicious of other close family members' deaths.
I'm also suspicious about the deaths of Dovie Weaver and Miss Sulla Bartlett, the sisters who died in Gadsden 30 miles from here. Miss Weaver died June 3, 1950, and Miss Bartlett on August 14, 1953. As usual, Nannie had been around nursing them during the period shortly before their death.
It seems no one was safe from old Nannie Doss.
Relatives and close friends in Alabama and North Carolina were astounded when they read stories about Mrs. Doss's poisoning two of her later husbands. Most of them never suspected anything was wrong. Then they decided to ask authorities to investigate the deaths of persons Mrs. Doss had nursed. I believe the poisoning spree may run into a dozen persons, but authorities in North Carolina and Alabama have placed the figure at 14 or 15.
Ever the investigators, Steege and Page, were looking for motive.
Insurance collections were small on most of the husbands, but Mrs. Doss tried to collect Social Security payments after some of her husband's deaths. At the time of her arrest, Miss Doss was negotiating with the U.S. Indian Agency seeking to collect benefits for husband number 4, Richard Morton. Morton was a Creek Indian, and Doss believed he was collecting heavy payments. She had not succeeded in getting any money. I believe she was giving arsenic to husbands and relatives for convenience and for money. But according to everyone I talked to, she was well liked, a good cook, housekeeper, and nurse.
Well, it's a prerequisite as a woman in the South to be able to cook.
It wouldn't have been her cooking skills that would worry me. It would have been her poisoning skills.
That thought wasn't lost on female press at the time. There were several editorials we discovered during our research. Female reporters were a new idea back in the 50s.
My, what a waste of husbands, scarce as they are. Miss Nannie Doss has confessed that she has poisoned 4. Truly, this is no time for women to be killing men. Keeping a husband is a major project for American wives, who must meet strong outside competition from the altar to the grave. Yet in spite of all of these facts, this Miss Doss was able to bury 4 husbands, and seemed to have had very little trouble getting a new one after each funeral. But the story proves again that a great many men have no knack for picking wives.
Nannie was putting on a show for those reporters. When a newsman suggested she might land another husband if she took off her glasses, Nannie said,
"Ain't it the dying truth?"
Nannie made a huge mistake when she poisoned Doss in Tulsa. Tulsa was a bigger city. Toxicology reports on her sister Dovie and her grandson Robert Higgins only showed trace amounts of arsenic. Further testing concluded that Dovie had died of natural causes, and that Nannie's grandson Robert died of asphyxia, lack of oxygen. But there was no ruling on what caused the toddler to stop breathing. In those small towns where she was disposing of husbands and some kinfolk, there wasn't much of an investigation, and she was free to marry and kill over and over again. Sam Doss, however, died in a hospital with a pathology department, and that changed everything. Sadly, we will never really know how many people died because of Nannie. Even in the family today, there's speculation, according to Nannie's great-granddaughter, Nicole Young, of just how many people died at her hands.
I had heard that she had poisoned way more than what was admitted to, and that some of her children were part of that as well.
Science made all the difference, even back then. Meanwhile, Nannie was having a ball. She was featured in more national media than any criminal in Tulsa had been up to that time, and she was holding court with the press. On the way into her arraignment, she was escorted by Captain Harry Steege, and Nannie joked with the reporters, saying she planned a meal she would like to feed Captain Steege, complete with black coffee. Harry Steege rejected that offer flatly. Press accounts state that when the judge first read the word murder, Nannie blinked quickly and dropped her eyes, sort of like an involuntary reflex. Nannie was assigned 2 public defenders to be her defense attorneys.
I told the judge I didn't have any money. Most of the insurance money was spent for funerals and to pay my husband's debts.
Gordon Patton took on the role as lead defense attorney representing Nannie.
We're not able to enter a plea for this defendant, and we renew our request that she be sent to an institution for 90 days for mental examination. We don't know from talking to her if her stories are true now or if her stories in the past were true. I asked that Ms. Doss be sent to the Eastern State Hospital for 90 days for a mental examination. There is some evidence of mental illness in her family, specifically her father. He died at a state mental institution in Tuscaloosa, Alabama about a year ago. We don't intend to make a plea for a crazy woman. We want her sent to a mental institution before any court action is taken.
The defense team believed Nannie's sanity should be evaluated before a plea was entered in court.
Of course, the prosecution representing the state was not pleased.
I'm willing to agree with the public defenders that Miss Doss be committed for observation, but the question cannot be raised properly until she was waived her preliminary hearing or had a hearing and had been bound over to district court.
The newspaper reported Nannie's smile, which had been on her face during hours of questioning by police, disappeared. She fumbled with a cigarette case in her right hand and her eyes twitched as Edmondson raised the point of mental examinations.
There was another issue brought up in court by defense attorney Gordon Patton.
I also may seek a court order to protect Mrs. Doss if the newspaper men and prosecutors continue to harass her for further statements. She had made a statement, and we don't believe she could be dragged out of the county jail and questioned every time an officer or county prosecutor has a whim.
Were the newspaper men really harassing her?
What do you think?
I think Nannie was the star of her own show, and she loved gabbing to the press. Many times police encourage that activity because they always hang themselves when they talk to the media.
She has talked too much already, and I will see to it that no one talks to her again if it's the last thing I do.
My lawyers told me not to talk anymore. I've already talked too much. I guess. My lawyers told me I was crazy. Then they said not to talk about my past. I'm willing to take their word for it until some doctor tells me different.
Prosecuting attorney Edmondson was having none of the Nannie Doss show on his watch.
I drew up murder charges against Miss Doss because she apparently killed her husbands just because they rubbed her the wrong way. She gave us a different reason for killing every one of them. She didn't do it for the insurance. She didn't get enough to more than pay for funeral expenses. She is a shrewd, clever, sharp, calculating, selfish, self-aggrandizing female whose aggressive behavior under frustration releases her hostility towards men, particularly her husband. She told me she poisoned Doss because he was mean to her.
Nannie's daughter Melvina had her own ideas about what might have motivated or not motivated her mother to kill.
I also know she didn't kill for insurance money. If that had been the case, I would not have been here. I was worth $4,500 to my mother when she married Doss.
By this time, the prosecution was already concerned with just how many people Nannie had killed. Because of the jurisdictional issues, the state of Oklahoma would try only one case that happened in their state, but they certainly kept up with the news from Alabama, North Carolina, and Kansas. Prosecutor Edmondson was keeping count.
Miss Doss denied any connection with the death of her 2 sisters, her mother, and a grandson. That grandson died a few months before husband number 2 Harrelson died.
Tulsa Police Captain Harry Steege wasn't finished investigating Nannie Doss.
This arraignment does not mean that we'll stop questioning her in connection with the other suspected deaths. Each death that Mrs. Doss is suspected of causing was attended with symptoms similar to those in arsenic deaths.
In the end, Nannie was sent off to Eastern Oklahoma State Hospital for a 90-day mental evaluation. Edmondson, the prosecutor, made it clear he expected a quick resolution.
Miss Doss would be returned to Tulsa after the 90-day period at the state hospital, and if declared insane, will have to be recommitted by the county court here. If found sane, she probably will go to trial sometime in the spring.
As Nannie stepped on the elevator, she was joking with Captain Steege.
Do you know what we were talking about? Mother Doss's cookbook.
Nannie found the subject quite funny and said her specialty was Southern fried chicken and biscuits.
It sounds delicious, but with that twinkle in her eye and a smile on her face, that would be a little scary. Press accounts at the time says that downstairs in the courthouse, she offered prosecuting attorney Edmondson a cigarette from a pack she was carrying around in a light-colored plastic case, and Edmondson took one and smoked it.
I'm not sure that was a wise thing to do.
I guess he was certain she didn't have access to poison. Nannie also made sure her adoring fans knew she wasn't crazy.
I don't understand those big legal words. They said something about a mental checkup, and I guess I need one. Maybe those docs at the hospital will teach me how to think straight. I guess I ought to know better than anybody if I'm crazy. I never felt more sane in my life. I'm as sane as anybody.
So off Nannie went to the state hospital to decide if she was as sane as everybody else.
Sane people don't often kill people. Most people that are clinically insane do not know they are insane. Their realities are not abnormal to them.
I don't know how I did it. Guess I was just lucky, that's all. I don't think I could do it again, unless I thought it was necessary.
The matron of the jail where Nannie was housed told reporters that Nannie slept all the time, had a huge appetite, and was always asking for something to read.
Nannie arrived at Eastern State Oklahoma Hospital and started doing what Nannie always did, charming the people. Dr. Felix Adams was the superintendent of the hospital and soon became one of Nannie's biggest allies.
Nannie Doss is making a good patient. It will be at least 3 weeks before my staff will complete examinations on her. Once completed, the reports will be furnished to Tulsa County Attorney J. Howard Edmondson.
By all accounts, she was a friendly, jovial patient. One doctor even reported if you had small children, you'd be delighted to have her as a babysitter.
Some of the doctors seemed to think that Nannie's old head injury might be to blame, and they were certain the headaches were real and she wasn't faking. Otherwise, they found Nannie to be in good health. Dr. Randy Hill agrees the train wreck could be blamed for the headaches.
She might have had some kind of post-concussive head injury where you could get headaches after that. That's believable.
Dr. McCoy asked Nannie about her mental health.
She admits to being somewhat nervous all her life and goes on to explain that she is very forgetful and has temperamental outbursts. She denies having blackout spells. She admits of fears of small closed spaces, high places, and seeing people have to suffer of an incurable illness. She has tingling sensations on the skin, especially her arms, while at other times she has a sensation like a bug crawling on her skin.
Good health, huh? Her husband's damn sure weren't in good health because they were dead. And she didn't like seeing people suffer, yet she's causing a lot of people to suffer? Nannie's daughter still thought the old injury might have had something to do with her behavior.
I don't think she is insane, but the train wreck when she was 7 might have had something to do with it. She fractured her skull, and for years afterward, I picked bones out of the roof of her mouth that doctors said were the result of the wreck.
What kind of injury is that?
Sounds like bullshit to me.
Nannie's great-granddaughter, Nicole Young, never heard that story either.
Nannie, by all reports, had a grand old time at the hospital. The matron who was in charge of her while she was there noted her moods.
From my own report, I noted the patient went into a 2-day laughing and giggling spell that was followed by an irritable and depressed period. She was elated over the idea of leaving the hospital when she was returned to the jail here. She prepared her clothes as if she were going on a picnic or a pleasure trip. The other ward patients gave her a farewell party. She dressed for it carefully, giggled all through it, and invited the others to come visit her. Mrs. Doss, most of the time, is a very small child, and that is abnormal.
Dr. McCoy seemed to see right through the act Nannie was presenting.
Psychologically, Nannie is seen as a person who presents many contradictory aspects. Initially, she appears very pleasant and almost overly friendly and cooperative. She strives to create the impression of one who is very kind, the type of person who cannot possibly do anything bad.
When the official report came out, no one was really surprised except maybe the prosecution. Dr. Adams from Eastern State Hospital made his findings clear.
We have completed our examination of this patient. Ms. Doss is mentally defective but is on the borderline of normalcy. She is mentally deficient in marked impairment of judgment and willpower. I recommend she be recommitted to Eastern State for care and treatment. She is not feeble-minded or moronic, but tests show she is not bright about some things. Mostly defective judgment, defective insight, and inability to comprehend the seriousness of her acts. She is what is known as a psychopathic type person. If Mrs. Doss were released today in her present condition, she would kill someone within 6 months. Yes, you or me or anyone else. She is incapable of making a rational defense. Her lawyers couldn't depend upon a thing she told them. She is functioning on the level of a 5 or 6 year old child. This woman is dangerous to society and needs treatment. It is our recommendation that she be committed to this institution for care and treatment.
Nannie was not pleased.
I've read in the paper what Dr. Adams said, but he's not right. I think I'm all right.
Mrs. Doss likes people to like her, and while Captain Steegey was around with an air of bonhomie, she was pleasant, talky, and cheerful. Today, her black eyes were ice-cold and suspicious. Her whole manner seemed to indicate that she now feels that somewhere along the line, someone, somehow, took advantage of her.
Dr. McCoy was even more direct with his evaluation.
Life has presented an array of bewilderments to Nannie, who witnessed the struggle between good and bad and the conflicts between her mother and her father. When neither of her first 2 marriages gave the usual emotional satisfaction of love and security, Nannie became more confused and uncertain. She became more self-centered, sought to get whatever she could from life for herself. Rejecting her former belief in goodness and kindness, she retained this only as an outer facade by which she could cleverly manipulate people in order to further her own best interests. She has little interest in the best interests of mankind or the promotion of human welfare, but attempts to justify her own selfish actions by feeble rationalizations.
The wheels of justice, as we know, move very slowly. The next step, according to Oklahoma law, was to haul Nannie back to Tulsa for a hearing with a jury deciding her sanity. A jury would listen to the evidence and then decide if Nannie would be going to a mental facility for treatment or off to the state pen for life or even to the electric chair. No woman in Oklahoma had ever been put to death. Then again, no woman in Oklahoma ever killed as many people as Nannie did.
No matter what, Nannie had seen her last days as a free woman. If Oklahoma couldn't get the charge of murder to stick, Kansas, North Carolina, and Alabama were all standing in line to try Nannie for the crimes she committed in their states.
A hearing was held in March of 1955. The court was packed and a jury was chosen. The defense and prosecution were gearing up for a battle. The question was, would the judge allow additional psychologists to examine Nannie? Nannie's defense attorney, Gordon Patton, hoped he could save her life. Patton wanted a quick trial and was hoping she would be returned to Eastern State Hospital for treatment instead of going to prison.
Prosecutor Edmondson was having none of that.
I will oppose a quick sanity trial because I want a psychiatrist outside of those at the state hospital to examine the confessed poisoner of 4 husbands. I need time to subpoena witnesses from other states to be present at trial to testify about Nannie's actions over the years.
The courtroom watched the legal sparring like a tennis match. Back and forth they went.
The county attorney has an elaborate setup. He has a battery of investigators. There are enough funds for hiring a psychiatrist and conducting such tests while we must sit here and depend on generous-hearted people and charity.
The public defenders representing Mrs. Doss are afraid of submitting her to an examination by a competent psychiatrist. They are just trying to hide her. They don't want her to be examined unless they are there to tell her what to say and do. They just don't want the court or jury to know the true condition of their client.
The defense attorney was sure of his client's condition.
In all earnestness, I feel this woman is mentally defective. Could she have poisoned 5 people, including her own mother, and be normal? This is contrary to the law of the jungle.
Even Nannie's family members thought Nannie's body count was much higher. Nicole Young is Nannie's great-granddaughter.
She killed the husband, some of the husband's mothers, some of their children, some of their brothers, and I mean, there was a lot more than what the prosecutors and everybody knew of.
Prosecuting attorney Edmondson was having none of that. He wanted to make sure Nannie Doss was punished for her crimes.
The courtroom sparring between Prosecutor Edmondson and the defense team added to the drama.
Dr. Adams' attitude appeared to change when I told him I planned to call another psychiatrist. Dr. Adams has been most cooperative, but he seemed unpleased when I told him about my intentions. He seemed to feel I questioned his ability. On the contrary, I have no doubt of his ability. I do believe he has to rely a large extent upon the observation of attendants who often are not trained in such work. I feel this case is such that the public is entitled to other competent opinions on Mrs. Doss's condition. I asked Dr. Adams to include the reports of individuals, attendants, and doctors in the report, but the hospital chief replied he would just restate the substance of what he already reported. Those detailed reports would be valuable in helping the psychiatrists determine what course they should follow.
She should not be in jail. She should be confined to an asylum in accordance with recommendations from the doctors at the state hospital. She's incapable of aiding us in her defense. The state is shopping around other psychiatrists in order to make an issue against the finding from the state hospital.
Finally, the judge ruled.
The examination may be conducted without her attorney present, but must be conducted only if Ms. Doss is agreeable. The state cannot compel her to undergo tests against her wishes.
Let me guess. She didn't say no.
Of course not. She'd be the star of her own show. No, Steve. Now is the time for Nannie and her sanity to take center stage. This concludes part 3 of this episode of The Coroner's Report, Nannie Doss, the self-made widow. There's more to this story and you don't want to miss it. If you like our content, please remember to like and subscribe and share this podcast with your friends. If you have questions, please reach out to us on our website at coronersreport.net or on any social media platform at The Coroner's Report. Special thanks to Nannie's great-granddaughter Nicole Young and Dr. Randy Hill for their insight. Thanks goes out also to voice actors J.D. West, Amy Oliver Barnes, Chris Schaefer, Alan Prather, Sean Davis, Savvy Valentine, and Diane Jones. Copyright 2025 Aussie Grove Media Group, LLC.